time, but for other people. So we are talking about this comment here, where there is this desire to have a kind of generic work item status widget that can be reused by different types. Like, and recently we renamed verification status as statuses in order to do that. And I totally agree with Melissa's desire to build something that's more broadly usable for work items. Here's sort of the pickle that I've been thinking about with this. Is that when you think about sort of this goal of having these different kind of state buckets to denote if something is actually done or not, if it's active or inactive. As we've sort of worked through this and also heard from Matthew and Dan that like requirements can have different like sort of workflow statuses about what the progress of them. We sort of end up with this kind of interesting thing where if we look at how it behaves today, there's a unit test, right, that contains some sort of link to the requirement, maybe in the title or whatever, which gets run in a job, which gets run as part of a pipeline, which then generates the test report. The test report gets uploaded as an JSON artifact or requirement.json file, which then kind of surfaces the status, the current status of satisfied, failed, unverified here in the requirement. The challenge with this, when you think about this, looking at how we would map these to the different buckets. Like if you think about the requirement, it might also be, let's say if it's in draft, right? What were the other statuses that Melissa said down here? Let's say in review, accepted by client. In review, accepted by client. So it's hard to tell like which buckets these fall in, right? I think in review would be definitely active. Draft would sort of be maybe if it's actively being drafted in the active bucket too. But while these different statuses are true of the requirement, it's like kind of life cycle. At the same time, it would be unverified until the pipelines run and the test report kind of generates stuff. And then if it does get generated, you could say like satisfied and passive exception are completed. But sort of like what happens if it then fails at some point in a later pipeline? Where do you put the failed? Which bucket do you put it in? Is it in inactive? Well, it could be failed and not being worked on to correct. It could be failed and working on to fix this, right? So it's like not clear how to bucket the output from the test report cleanly into the buckets for the different statuses, and then reconciling those with sort of the workflow statuses on a requirement. And the other thing to think about is that like in this sort of kind of flow, this all like everything to the left of requirement is the test report. I would just call it a test report. And so if we think about how this is going to work and we want to have like a generic status widget that all work items can work with, you almost need to have it be a separate widget from the test report, because it's impossible to know if what the actual status is of the requirement itself in terms of its, is somebody working on it or not? Is it actively being worked on or not? And so this would sort of let you have your own, I wouldn't even call this status with the test report. It's just a state almost, like because these things don't really change and you can't really change them unless the code passes. Either the pipeline is never run against a requirement, in which case it's unverified. It still could be being worked on, but the merge request hasn't been put up yet, so it's going to be unverified. And then at some point when maybe it's in review is when the pipelines start running. it could even be put into a satisfied state before it gets accepted by a client, right? So I don't know if a client would accept it until the tests, or I guess the tests are saying that it's satisfied. So that's sort of where I was thinking. I don't know if you agree with me. Like the only way to like sort of cleanly solve this is to have your test report be a separate widget, right? And then what we can do, and this is the, if you think about like from a value standpoint, this is all the stuff that is in Ultimate, which is tying a work item to a test, basically a pipeline job test report. And separating it out would make it clean to kind of package this up. And then the stats widget is sort of a separate thing. But if this is sort of available, then Server can figure out how they want to map any sort of like automations that happen between the test report widget and how that transitions the status widget. I also think in the future, Nick and I are we're talking about like right now, I think this is a one-to-one behavior. But you might have lots of different unit tests that all need to pass. Unit test 2. And then you might have a unit test 3 that gets mapped to a job that gets executed in a job. And maybe all of these are linked to the same requirement. And in order for that requirement to be satisfied, all 3 of these need to be passed. And I imagine at some point, customer are going to ask for, can I see test reports breakdown or status or test runs or whatever in a little widget in a requirement itself. So that's almost like we're thinking a little bit ahead. We might want to have a test report widget that has these unverified, satisfied, passed, failed, and decouple that from the like life cycle of the requirement might go through, because if it's failed, we might trigger that to transition into some other status, right? That would then do something, but it doesn't seem like it's lining up well to like smash these 2 things together into one thing, at least from like a generalization standpoint. Do you have any thoughts on that, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think I initially was thinking of this in the more linear flow, but I think if it's true that something could be satisfied while it's in review, I mean, then that automatically kind of makes that hard to do, because you'd have 2 simultaneous statuses and one would have to win, but then you kind of don't have a lot of clarity. And I don't really want to end up in a situation where we're doing like sub statuses or something like in review satisfied or something like that, like as a parentheses. Like I would probably rather keep these separate. If that's not a consideration, like that we have to think about, like, you know, what you'd end up having to do, I think, would be to use essentially automation to make that work in a generalizable way, right? Like, because other work items aren't going to have test reports. So you'd have to basically create like a generic automation capability and then create a rule for just requirements that is tied to the test report, which I don't know. I mean, we want to do stuff like that eventually, but I don't know if that's more complicated than this sort of route, where you can just kind of utilize this on its own. I mean, we do know, we talked just this morning with the customer that basically, I think, talked through that use case of, I want to see everything down from the story down to the requirements, down to the individual tests that were run against those requirements, you know, and even to the kind of environment level for those tests. So I mean, yeah, that request is not just forthcoming, but already something we're hearing.
Well, the other interesting challenge about this, speaking of that, is that if you think about how pipelines and all that stuff actually work, it's not really clean, right? Like you have, I mean, it's clean how they work, but in this scenario, and this is what is typical of GitLab today, you might have all of this happening simultaneously, where you have 3 feature branches or 2 feature branches, a main branch. When we run a pipeline, we run it against the branch usually. And so you might link to a requirement in your feature branch and it passes there. But then when you merge feature branch into your main branch, it fails, right? You could also, a requirement could fail in a certain environment, like environment A, and staging, it might pass in environment B, like during deploys, because the pipelines also run during deploys, which they, I think, generally run all of the tests and the test suites as part of that as well. So you get in this sort of like complex, like there's lots of places where it could pass and fail, depending on which environments it's on. And like right now, I think the workaround is you only set your requirements verification to happen when you merge a feature branch into main. And that's something you could do, but it also does get a little bit complicated even within when you do that. Like in GitLab, for example, our deploy pipeline pushes things to staging. Then I think it pushes things to canary. Then I think it pushes things to production. And you almost need to know if it does fail, in which environment does it fail, or is it currently failing, right? And there's also use cases today where the pass with exception is where they'll quarantine, engineers will quarantine a flaky test because something's wrong with the test, not necessarily with the code. And so they're basically saying, it's fine if we don't run this test right now. We're willing to take the risk, so we're just not going to run it, right? Which then would have implications also on things like this. I think it's all stuff for the certified team to figure out, but it does feel like we just can't like do all that, smash it all together.
Is there so in that environment, right? Like you go through your workflow. Your workflow basically ends at accepted, meaning that this requirement is now in a usable state. And it would never, like, there'd never really be a completed status, right? Or would we somehow mirror the verification status in the workflow status? Because that's where I could see that getting kind of confused.
I mean, I think accepted by client, what I'd say would be completed. The requirement is accepted by the client, which means it's completed and done. They've accepted it. But even after it's been accepted by the client, it could fail in a future point in time if the code changes. At which point it would you automatically move this to, like, would it no longer be, it would have to be like sort of kick it back into this a new workflow of, okay, this whatever the intake is for this triage, and then it would have to kick this back into whatever an inactive state was, and then an engineer would pick it up, triage it, fix it, it would go through, then it would have to get accepted again as it's passing, yeah, I don't know what necessarily to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's mostly a question from like, I'm just thinking like feature state, you're looking at a list, you're looking at boards, you're looking at like stuff to do, most likely you're probably filtering out some of your requirements and things, unless that's what you are looking for. But how do you find those things that need attention? And if it's, if you're just filtering out things that are let's say like you're filtering for things that are in like an active state, like things to work on, if it's completed in that sense, but it's failed, like you wouldn't necessarily see it. I don't know. Like there's obviously ways around that. You'd create different views and things like that to get to requirements that are failing based on that status or something like that. But that is just kind of a nuance of the different items getting potentially mixed together. I mean, this kind of makes sense. I think in this model, like if you think about this from like a widget perspective, like this would probably, at least as I'm thinking about it, and again, I think something for the certified team to figure out would be a verification or like test report app, where you could basically like app in the sense of we have like the attribute widgets, which are generally like your iterations. It's like a single thing, and if we only cared about verified, unverified, it could be an attribute. But if we expect to want to be able to list out like what environments and where and what test cases and things like that in the future, You could build that like a little bit more robustly, probably as something like an app. Another example of an app would be like related links or something like that, or tasks even on like an issue. So you could use something like that and kind of bubble that up, and then still bubble that up to the metadata that's used in other places. Because I assume if you were ever looking at a requirement in a list view or something, you'd still want to see what the main status, like verification status of that would be. That's not really a use case that we have. I mean, this will be the first time I think we're doing that on the work item, so some stuff to be figured out there, but that's kind of how I envision some of that stuff working.
Yeah, the other thing I think is interesting about this too, and if you think about not just a test report app, but a lot of times when I'm looking at an issue to see if I can review it, I want to know. Well, I can see the merge requests, but I can't see which environment they're in. Like if they're in the deploy process, where I have to go to test it, if it's ready, and more or less like some of this more metadata about it. And I'm wondering if there's a way to make this even a little bit more generic instead of just a test report app. It sort of gives you like a current status of where your issue is in terms of environments, pipeline statuses, and that sort of thing. Because there's also, I can't remember, I don't have it open right now. There was an ask to be able to associate a pipeline directly to a work item of type test case or test session, I think is what it was. So that when your tests are running, you see which pipeline they're running in. And then you can click into that pipeline and go look at like the test reports, I guess is the use case there. But it's sort of, this is really just tying in all of this information into a specific work item where the relationship is driven by the work item ID being associated to, I guess, one of the unit tests. I definitely think it's something that for certified to think about, but it also opens up the door if you do think about it a little bit more generically for a lot of cool integration of like downstream DevOps data into work items. Anything else to add for that? Otherwise, we can stop recording and go on to other stuff on the agenda.
No, I don't think so. This is all pretty new functionality to me, so it's enlightening to learn about it, but also sort of map it back to the work items and kind of how we can make that more appropriately reusable, but also not like where it needs to be kind of more specific in some cases.
Yeah. Okay, cool.